Bringing survival horror to the small screen is no easy accomplishment. As a genre, it's a really hard balancing act, even without factoring in the limitations of a handheld system. So how did Capcom's first attempt at survival horror on the Game Boy go? It failed, in the sense that it just wasn't scary. But there were still a few surprises here, and I really think fans are going to get a kick, just because Revelations came along and started to flesh out a few of the concepts that Gaiden began to explore. So, a Game Boy is a pretty strange place to find one of the best survival horror franchises of all time, especially in 2001 when we already had the much more powerful, much more capable Game Boy Advance. And the Resident Evil franchise itself was still deeply rooted in actual survival horror, not action, with games like Code Veronica and Resident Evil 3. I guess people were just demanding more Barry Burton. There's been a few proposed timelines for this game to take place in, but without this game being considered canon, there's no official word on it. So with characters like Leon Kennedy making an appearance, we can assume this game takes place after Raccoon City, but seriously, who cares? By this stage, I'm literally just taking every Resident Evil plot as it comes. I can't keep up. So Resident Evil Gaiden does stray from the horror angle, but Capcom really ensured that this game wouldn't interfere with any other plots from their other RE titles. So you're on a ship, isolated, playing as Barry Burton after the events of the first game. Nothing that you can accomplish here will ever be officially recognised in the Resident Evil universe. Capcom isolated this game so much, they actually outsourced the work to an English studio called M4, which starts to beg the question, could this be considered an official Resident Evil game at all? It's called Gaiden, which literally means spin-off, so it's not canon. It wasn't developed by Capcom, and by this point, the only thing really going for it are the words Resident Evil printed right there on the cartridge, which mine doesn't have either, because I bought the Japanese version. But when I was doing a little bit more research, I was surprised to find out that Capcom sent 2 advisors to oversee production of this game. Shinji Mikami, who's actually credited as creating the Resident Evil series, and Toroki Kato, who was the director for the Code Veronica games. These are 2 really big names for Capcom and the Resident Evil series, and I don't normally name drop on the Leftover Culture review, especially names that I have trouble pronouncing, but these guys were there just to make sure Resident Evil Gaiden would work, and there are things here that I really enjoyed. It's not the first survival horror game to be set on a boat, but I am glad that they decided to limit their scope and just focus on it. The graphics come off really well, and making the zombies look gross and shambling on the Game Boy Color was always going to be a challenge, and I think they look fantastic. Seeing the enemies up close like this, even though there's not that many different types of enemies, is still sort of breaking that classic Resident Evil formula. But considering the limitations of the Game Boy Color, it's a way to get a sense of what poor old Barry is going through, and it sets up one of the more dividing features in this game, which is going to be the fighting system. Fighting in Gaiden actually feels a bit like playing a minigame, and secretly, I really enjoy it. It feels like a really good compromise between having control and a fighting chance, and just being able to wreak havoc on zombies. And to bring up Revelations again, all the weapon firing and aiming is done in the first person view. And sure, the 3DS could do it in 3D. But again, it feels like Gaiden was setting the example here. And sure, it feels low-tech, kind of what you'd expect Resident Evil on the NES to look like, but that is seriously its charm. Playing this game on the Game Boy does make it a little bit harder to recommend though. you can only save at certain times in the game. And these aren't save points that you can revisit. It's save once and keep moving. For a Game Boy game that doesn't have sleep mode, it feels like an oversight. So Capcom weren't strangers in trying to bring Resident Evil to a handheld format. It started with a pretty ambitious Resident Evil 2 for the Tiger.com, and I guess you knew that they were not messing around. Capcom built their handheld Resident Evil games from the ground up so they'd scale well, play well, and suck the gamer into a miniature version of their first 2 Resident Evil games. But going back to the humble Game Boy, this long line of Resident Evil handheld titles didn't actually start with Gaiden. What I found more surprising was their attempt to port their original Resident Evil game to the Game Boy Color. This thing looks like technical wizardry, and this port is actually pretty close to being finished. But as interesting as it is to look at now, it doesn't exactly scream marketable product. From these ashes, and also contractual obligations, Resident Evil Gaiden got started, and it feels like a much more suitable way to deliver a really good handheld Resident Evil experience. This is not survival horror. It's been labelled action-adventure, and in that sense, I think it really works. It still got slammed in its day, but reviewing these games that have been long considered dead, you can sometimes see a gem starting to grow in there. It's a unique Resident Evil story, with a flicker of where the series was going, and it's an experience that I felt aged really well. But if you've got other reasons for hating this game, then hey, let me know in the comments. And thanks so much for watching anyway. Take it easy and stay safe.